Welcome to the Speak Up Talk Radio Network. I am your hostess, Pat Rullo. We bring you hand-selected hosts, podcasts, and talk radio programming with the purpose to inform and empower. We also feature one-on-one segments with important guests, people who have something to say that you need to hear. And if you have something to say and would like to be featured on the network, please visit speakuptalkradio.com for all of the details or contact us at pr@speakuptalkradio.com. Well, today I have quite the special guest returning with me, an author. She is Laurel A. Rockefeller. Laurel is the author of well over 20 books, published and self-published since August of 2012, and in languages ranging from Welsh to Spanish to Chinese and everything in between. She is a scholar and a biographical historian, and is passionate about education and improving history literacy worldwide. And I know I have personally learned some valuable historical information from her, and with that, I'm excited to share her important work with you. So welcome back, Laurel.
Hi, nice to see you again. It's been, October the last time?
I think so. I'm so happy to have this opportunity again. You're just a wealth of knowledge, and as I said, I learned so much from you about things I've never given much consideration to, so you are a gift. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's glad to be back.
Good. Well, today we are going to focus on your most recent book. I understand it was quite an undertaking that you wrote with great fervor, so tell us about it.
It's called His Red Eminence, Armand-Jean du Plessis de Richelieu, who, of course, is better known as simply Cardinal Richelieu. And yes, I wrote, it is my longest book so far. It clocks at over 350 pages in paperback. And I wrote it in just under 2 months' time. And the fun story with this, of course, is remember how we were gearing up for the holidays when we were talking about Cleopatra. I received the 2014 BBC television series, The Musketeers, for December holiday gift. You know, we love getting DVDs at Christmas, right?
Yes.
And when I got the DVD, so I couldn't stop watching it. It stars, of course, Peter Capaldi as Cardinal Richelieu. And unlike so many other things that I watched, I started watching and I just couldn't stop until finally I had to start writing about Richelieu. I wanted it to be about Marie de Medici, but I don't like her. And I found out along who likes her? I mean, genuinely, no one in France likes Marie de Medici. But you kind of find out along this process that in order for me to write about someone, I have to like them. Mm-hmm. You know, that person has to live in my head for weeks or months or sometimes years at a time. And if I don't like that person enough to do it, it's just not going to happen. I mentioned that in the introduction of the book.
Now, on your website, you indicate that this book relies heavily upon Richelieu's political testament written to King Louis XIII near the end of his life. Now, I know you did lots of research, so what did you learn from it that we might not otherwise know about him?
Armand-Jean du Plessis was one of the most prolific writers of the time. You just wonder how he had time for anything, but not many of his books survived. This one did. And there's some really fascinating things that I did pick up. Like, for example, you would think that he'd be universal education. He really was not in favor of it. He has some interesting reasons for not being in favor of universal education. The number one is he felt that vocational education was far more important. His position was like, if a farmer knows how to read and write, and if they have a university degree, a liberal arts degree as we put it now, then that farmer doesn't know what the farmer needs to know in order to be able to produce the crop that gets everybody fed. That he felt that education should be practical in nature. And I believe in Europe they still have more of that sort of impetus that education should be about a trade, studying for a specific profession, as opposed to in America we like to study the liberal arts. We want people to be well-rounded. So it's a different approach to education, and that was something Richelieu had. Richelieu really believed that the liberal arts are liberal arts education. You know, like I have a bachelor's degree in psychology and history and writing as well, and I'm sure you have similar degrees yourself. But that should really be for the people who are most talented at that. And that's kind of surprising. He also did incidentally believe when they came to schools, a lot of the education at the time was the purview of the church. You remember that, I'm sure. Mm-hmm. He didn't believe that the church should be in charge of education entirely. He did believe in secular education because it was always about balance and counterbalance. You never want to let any side go too extreme. And this was a time of extremes. A lot of our sense of moderation and secularization and public service and public good does come directly from Cardinal Richelieu. And I think people would find that very surprising, but it comes really through in the political testament.
Now, you also dedicate this book to Peter Capaldi, a friend of yours. I mean, I think you're pretty fond of Peter Capaldi. What role did he play in your decision to research and write this book?
I think it was because I couldn't stop watching the DVDs. His performance, and I believe you pointed out to me in our conversations off air that Dumas most people know about him through Dumas, and Dumas had a very particular way of presenting the cardinal. And we'll go into the reasons why in a moment. But Peter Capaldi's performance of Richelieu was just so very different than what you see in anything else about him. You know, any of the Musketeers, any of the biography, it was just so very different and much truer to the real man than I've seen in other productions. And I think that really captured my imagination, really got me going about wanting to work on this. I just couldn't stop watching it. And that was one way I kept myself going. I kept myself focused for the 2 months of writing this, is I just kept watching the DVDs over and over again. So I kept this sort of 24/7 focus on Richelieu, which was fantastic, to borrow a word from the Ninth Doctor. But yeah, I think without Capaldi's performance, I wouldn't have been interested in doing this at all.
Oh, I love that. You and your cockatiels spent 2 months watching the DVDs, right?
Well, the DVDs are very good. I'm getting a set out of them during a promotional book tour that I'm doing in May. So maybe you'll be the one who wins the DVDs, and
there you go.
You'll be seeing what I mean. Yeah, absolutely. Why not, right? Good on you.
You're awesome. Now, one of the most famous events in Cardinal Richelieu's life is referred to as the Day of the Dupes. What is that, and why is it famous?
The Day of the Dupes was the most perilous moment of his life. This was a period of about 48, 72 hours where he genuinely might have lost his head. And there's a scene in the book where he goes to his best friend Anne, who is our central female figure in the book, and it's like, these things that you think are going to happen for me, they're not going to happen. I'm going to lose my head. I'm going to die. And there's nothing anybody can do about it. What happened was this, is that Queen Anne of Austria, the Queen of France, who, by the way, at this point has not had, this is November 10th through the 12th, 1630. So this is right after the conclusion of the Wars of Religion, after his massive success with the siege of La Rochelle and the treaty of, I believe it's Alais, that was signed earlier that year. Obviously Marie de Medici hates him. She hates him for a very good reason. I don't have to read the book because I can't talk about them in 5 minutes. I can't explain all Marie de Medici's vices in 5 minutes. But Queen Anne of Austria, childless so far, even though they've been married since Louis and Anne were very close in age. So since they were about 14 years old, get together and they decided, we have to get rid of this guy. We don't like what he's doing. We got to get rid of him. And the Day of the Dupes is when the two of them almost succeeded. Well, actually, they did succeed in getting Louis to agree to dismiss him and possibly arrest him. And then after he's summoned to Versailles, a couple of Richelieu's friends who I don't really know much about sort of talk to the king and say, calm down. You're just angry. You're just being under these pressures. In the morning it'll seem better. And in the morning, and after Richelieu gets from Paris to Versailles, which by the way was about a 12-hour trip by carriage. It wasn't close by. It took a while to travel in the times. By the time he gets there, the king succeeds and sleeps on it. The king succeeds and changes his mind and says, "Oh, never mind. It's okay." And the king really was yelling at him the day before, but when he gets to Versailles, he's like, "Oh, you know what? I would be crazy to get rid of you." And a key reason why Louis changed his mind was he came to the conclusion after sleeping on it, after talking to some people, that the only way he was ever going to have power in his own right was through Richelieu. Because he was finally persuaded to realize that Marie was only in it for herself. She wanted to get rid of Richelieu because she wanted to have power over the king. as mothers often have power over their sons. And Cardinal Richelieu was a true public servant and he was in her way. So of course she went and gone.
Right.
But it was the most dangerous time of his life. And after that, there continued to be plots and so forth and so on, but it never got life-threatening for the cardinal. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank goodness the king slept on it and came to his senses, right?
Right.
Oh, right. Wow. So Richelieu, he's very much loved by the French people today and travel around France, and there's countless memorials to him. So what other contributions did he make to French culture or politics or society that makes the French people love him so?
Well, first of all, you can't travel around France without running into something he did. Specifically, he worked with an architect by the name of Jacques Le Mercier, who was one of the best architects of the 17th century. Through working together, the two of them working together completely redesigned the Sorbonne, which was his alma mater, where he went and got his doctorate in theology, or his degree in theology. So he completed the entire campus of the Sorbonne was rebuilt by Richelieu and by Le Mercier. Nearly all of those buildings are, it's a parody of them, and that actually is where he is entombed. The church at the Sorbonne, the church at the Sorbonne in the chapel there was finished just about 3 or 4 months before he died, and that's where you'll find Richelieu. And he was, but a century later, people, even with the French Revolution, people realized that Richelieu was important enough that they didn't tamper with his body that much during the French Revolution. And for someone who was very much in line with the king, the French Revolution was attacking everybody. They didn't really attack it. They had a certain respect for Richelieu through that. So there's a lot of buildings across Paris, including, of course, the Palais Cardinal, which became the Palais Royal after he died, because he had to will it to somebody. He obviously didn't have a son to will it to. So he gave it to King Louis XIII. But the king gave him this wonderful estate, very, very close to walking distance to the Louvre, which was the main palace at the time. So you'll see that. He helped found the very first newspaper in France called La Gazette. That was one of the first things he did as first minister. Around the 1630s, he helped establish the Académie Française, which established standardized French. What is proper grammar in French? What is proper syntax? What's the definition of this word? What's the definition of that one? That was from the Académie Française, which he himself started. He got the royal charter for it, and he was very foundational in creating all of that. There is a city that was built over the original medieval village that he grew up with called Richelieu. So it's just a little manor village where he played as a child, and he designed a city that is a protected historical landmark. The Chateau Richelieu, which was the rebuilding, Jacques Le Mercier rebuilt the family home for him, that was destroyed along the way with French Revolution and so forth. But there was an enormous amount of architecture, music. He invested heavily in paintings and sculptures and other art forms, even though 90% of his collection he absolutely hated. So I can go on and on and on about the cultural impacts that he did. He did most of it because he wanted France to have to be the cultural center of the Western world, and he succeeded in that.
Mm-hmm. So then how come, and you kind of alluded to this before when you talked about Alexandre Dumas in the Three Musketeers, that's how most people know who he might be. Why was he depicted as so self-serving and, a brutally ruthless ruler? It doesn't sound like that was very accurate.
As talented as Armand-Jean de Plessis was on most things, he was really horrible when it came to economic policy. It was a taxation issue. And he just didn't understand how a tax impacted the everyday person. And consequently, the average Frenchman hated him, at least at the time, because it took a very long time for this grand vision that Richelieu had. It took a long time before they really blossomed. In fact, most of the things that he did didn't blossom until the Sun King, Louis XIV's time, and his successor, Cardinal Mazarin. It took a while. It takes a while to reform how governments interact with each other. And his diplomacy, a lot of his diplomacy didn't really see its full fruition until about 30 to 50 to 100 years later. So, because these things just simply take time. You can't build Rome in 3 hours, and you couldn't build what he was doing building in 3 hours. But I think a lot of it came from an absolute hatred. The other thing is that Dumas was very much a Republican. He absolutely hated the idea of monarchy at all. And here is the ultimate statesman serving the crown, focusing on the crown's power, giving crown back. But I didn't know until I started this, is that France was basically a medieval backwater right into the early 17th century. Remember how King Henry V of England basically won the Battle of Agincourt because he had more modern warfare technology. He was using bows and all this instead of the high medieval knights of the French. You remember that, right? Mm-hmm. That was basically still the condition he was ordained and made a bishop in 1608. 1607, 1608 is when he entered the priesthood. That was still the condition in France at the time. France was still operating as if it was in the 11th century for the most part. So he was making so many changes, and that made him the ultimate royalist, because he took the power away from the nobility, even though he was himself a nobleman. He was the third son of the Seigneur de Plessis, or the Seigneur de Richelieu. Richelieu was the place where he lived. Duplessis was his family name. And Dumas how can you strike out against royalty without striking Richelieu?
It takes me back to when you mentioned Peter Capaldi playing that role in the Dumas novel. So I know you touched on it earlier, but let's just talk about the accuracy of that version.
I find that the Capaldi version of Richelieu is probably the most accurate I've seen, because in the books and in the other forms of it, he is a sort of selfish, conniving. He seems very corrupt from the Dumas, right? Mm-hmm. But in the BBC production, the way Peter Capaldi plays him specifically, Richelieu is really about serving the crown. And that is true. Richelieu's main motivation all times was, what is in the interest of my country? What is in the interest of the public good? He was a public servant. We wish we had public servants like that today. Sadly, those are few and far between now. And then historically, you might say they were also few and far between now. But the motivation of, I am my country's servant, as the center of it. He would do anything to help his country. And you just don't get that in Dumas. But Peter Capaldi's performance, it does come through loud and clear. This is what I'm about. I want my country to be strong. I want it to be secure. I will do whatever it is I can to help my people thrive.
Mm-hmm. So obviously through your research and watching, just scrutinizing the movie, you have learned so much, and you've shared a lot of tidbits with us today. But is there anything else about him that you think we should know?
I think his stories are much more complicated than we realize. He was much more he comes off as an extremist because he was so extreme compared to the people around him. But he was much more of a moderate. When you read his book, he will go, here's the pros on this side, here's the cons on this, and the middle ground is this, and I think this is what we should go with. You don't think of him as being a moderate. You don't think of him as being this cool, logical person. And also, he is portrayed as being extremely cold. I don't think he was nearly that cold. We don't think of him as being someone who sings and dances and goes to court and all this. And you've noticed this in my other books as well. I bring up that side of life because we don't think of that in history books, that people were playing guitar and they were singing songs and they were dancing. And but of course, they didn't have DVD players at the time. They didn't have MP3 players. If you wanted music, you had to do it yourself or get a friend to. Mm-hmm. And he was very much a part of that. Also, he loved very deeply. We don't know much about the central female in his life. I called her Anne Rochefeuille. If you pay attention to my name, you might figure out where I came up with that name. But we do know through the absence, through what's not being said, quite a bit about who she was, because you cannot have someone stay true to such a course that's so different than everybody else around you without having someone in your life who is your rock, your foundation, someone who keeps you on task. And I believe he had a lover, possibly named Anne, but I gave her that name for the sake of storytelling, who kept him on course, who helped him see the value of religious liberty, who helped him see the value of making the state more secular, that it shouldn't be about your personal beliefs about religion that rules the state, that it needs to be about what's fair and what's just and what serves the public interest. And religious liberty always serves the public interest. Theocracies do not work. And I don't think people realize that about him. I don't think they ever think of him as a man who loves deeply. And there was a very powerful love story in this book.
Yes, absolutely. And I love that about you, in that you bring that out to give all sides and facets of this person as being a human being. Right.
People don't think of him as a human being. They don't think of it. They see the unpopular parts. Well, yeah, the taxes were high, but as a result of those taxes, 20, 30, 40 years down the line, France is the great gold, is the leader of the Western world. So it takes a while sometimes to see the fruits of what you plant. I was just thinking about some of the music when we were talking about that foundation. One of the wonderful songs that I brought into this book is very unexpected. And again, I think this is because the best friend, that sort of centering force in his life, probably was a Huguenot. And so one of my favorite songs, of course, is A Mighty Fortress Is Our God. And I have 8 songs in this book. And we'll talk about why I have 8 songs. But I want to just kind of sing for you, really. Now that we're thinking, I want to sing for you one of my favorite songs in the book.
Okay.
Which is C'est un rempart que notre Dieu, which is A Mighty Fortress Is Our God by Martin Luther, which is a figure I would love to talk about. He and Luther are kind of an intriguing bunch when I think about it. But this is A Mighty Fortress Is Our God in French, which towards the end of the book you will hear it when Anne is playing it on her harpsichord and singing it, because it's a really powerful song. And since we're in this kind of slow and steady and very regal kind of mood, I think this would be a good time to bring this up.
Perfect. Thank you.
And I'm going to take a sip of water really, really fast before I do it.
Whenever you're ready.
C'est un rempart que notre Dieu, un invincible, notre délivrance est tout lion, notre défense sourde. Satan, notre ennemi, un jour s'est puni, de son pouvoir, pour encore de ses voix. Il n'y a plus d'abri. I think it's one of the most beautiful songs. Martin Luther wrote that. And the interesting thing with Martin Luther, of course, is he was really responsible for bringing up the Protestant Revolution, is really credited to him. Richelieu hated him, although personality-wise, Luther and Richelieu were extremely similar to each other, which is really, really fun and ironic.
Oh, I see another book coming.
Actually, I'm thinking about starting a biography of Katharina von Bora, who was Luther's wife.
Okay.
So that is up for 2020 or 2021. Is I'll probably be working on that. But I think having the Lutheran song in this book makes a very powerful statement, because so much of what's going on is the war of religion. I talk about the siege of La Rochelle, which is another one of those massive events in Richelieu's life. And this happened, by the way, just before the Day of Dupes. And what he has to do is that Richelieu has to go in and lead French armies into battle in a big siege against this Protestant stronghold. Protestants had actually seized territory from France and were in open rebellion against the King of France, perhaps ultimately to overthrow France, with the help of the Duke of Buckingham, of Dumas fame, of Three Musketeers fame. Only, of course, the Duke of Buckingham was a homosexual, and therefore he had nothing to do with Queen Anne. He might have flirted a little bit to sort of make people think he wasn't homosexual, but he was homosexual. But he did get involved in the siege of La Rochelle, And there was a massive war going on between Catholics and Protestants. And so putting this in is kind of showcasing that Protestant side that he was dealing with. And he was dealing with Protestants all the time. But Richelieu was unusual. That he believed in religious liberty, that the way to secure the country was to allow people free worship according to their conscience. And so that's why I think that song is so important to have in there.
Now, there are 8 songs in this book. That's twice as many as you had in your biographies of Queen Elizabeth Tudor and Mary Queen of Scots. So you mentioned it before, but how come there are so many?
I think it's just the cultural aspect of it. Richelieu brought so much culture into French society, and he was so dedicated to try to make this a part of people's lives. He really did believe in it. He believed that people should have the opportunity to enjoy something more than the drudgery of work. There should be beautiful things around and beautiful sights and sounds, and he believed in it so firmly. And also, just as a storyteller, I enjoy putting music and dancing and all this. And so, for instance, in Mary Queen of the Scots, you learn to dance the washerwoman brawl. Don't ask me to pronounce this in French right now. I don't have it in front of me. This time you learn to dance a dance called Black Nag, which is a contour dance or English country dance. The Scots would be horribly offended if you called it English country dance because it was performed everywhere in Europe. And I walk you through it. Are you familiar with Jane Austen and especially Pride and Prejudice and some of the adaptations where you have these glorious dancing scenes going on and they're doing this dancing in the line and they're talking to each other and Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet and all that, right? You're familiar with those?
Absolutely, yes. I
have scenes just like that in this book with the dancing, which I think is absolutely fantastic. But a lot of it's part of conveying the culture. And also it works for my storytelling. I'm shocked at how many Christmas carols I have in this thing. And I was really surprised, if you don't mind if I sing a little bit.
Sure.
Adeste Fidele, O come all ye faithful. We associate this with Victorian time. That's because it wasn't translated into English until Victorian time. But it was actually written about the 7th or 8th, maybe 9th century by a French monastic order called the Cistercians, and it was written into Latin. So people were just singing in Latin for 1,000 years before they brought it into English. And this appears in one of the scenes. Adeste fidele, lati triumphantes, venite, venite in Bethlehem. Latum videte, regim angelorem, venite adoremus, venite adoremus, venite adoremus, Domino. As with many other books, Veni Veni makes an appearance. Veni Veni Emmanuel, captivum solve Israel, qui gemit in exilio, privatus Deo filio, Godai, Emmanuel, nascite prote Israel. But the most important song in the entire book is Belkitian. And I know that's one of your favorites, isn't it, Pat, Belkitian?
Yes, thank you.
Let me give you a verse of that. And Belkitian gets reprised. So it doesn't appear in the book once, it appears more than once. Specifically, with the Siege of La Rochelle, I gave Armand-Jean one of my habits, which is when I'm feeling things very deeply, I like to go off by myself, and I can just kind of sing whatever I'm feeling. And he goes off and he sings some of Belkitian, because obviously he goes through a war. This is one thing I bring also into the book you don't think about, is I give Armand-Jean du Plessis post-traumatic stress disorder. I give him shell shock, because the Siege of La Rochelle was very vicious. He was leading armies into battle. He was nearly killed in battle, and that's going to affect you emotionally. So he goes off by himself and he sings, se courir, enfant l'amour. I know you want me to sing that one.
Thank you.
It's a favorite.
Oh, I didn't know if you're going to get to it or not. I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we might hear about guillotine again sometime because although what my upcoming is Hildegard von Bingen, which is a German abbess who was from the High Middle Ages, I think around 11th or 12th century, and she was one of the most important figures in terms of, she was a medieval scientist, she was a doctor, a philosopher, a teacher, obviously an abbess. She also suffered from chronic migraine, severe chronic migraine. And incidentally, this is something most people don't know about Richelieu. He was a migraineur. He was crippled. For all the things he accomplished, he did it with extremely poor health.
Wow.
He was sick most of the time.
Oh.
And that was another reason why I believe that Anne existed, was because how can anybody live at all when they're sick that much? Nobody's an island. You can't get through life without help. And so he must have had someone helping him. He must have had someone who was there day in, day out, helping him through the migraines. He had malaria quite often. When this was before you had ice cubes or aspirin, anything like this to help you with a fever. I mean, you could die from these illnesses, and he had them repeatedly. So he must have had someone there helping them out with all this stuff. So Hildegard was very important in developing some of these treatments. No doubt Anne was using later on. And then, of course, I really am thinking about Katharina von Bora, because as the wife of Martin Luther, she did so much in terms of shaping religion. And one thing about Katharina, and also I put in this book with Anne Rochefort, is being the intellectual equal. I think Richelieu thrived and was able to do what he did because he had a female, a friend, a lover, whatever, in his life who was his intellectual equal, who kept him on task, who wouldn't let him fall too far into vanity. He was treated as vain. Because one thing about Richelieu is that he did not consider himself inferior to princes. He did not think that being born a royal made that royal person better than him. He was very much into meritocracy. And I think, again, someone had to be in his life challenging him, keeping him steady about that, so he could walk that confidently and meet the eyes of the king and say, "No, Your Majesty, I'm sorry, I don't think you should be doing that." That was another thing, misconception with Dumas. Dumas had Richelieu as a flatterer. He has an entire chapter in Political Testament talking about why flattery is a bad idea. He didn't flatter. He was more like a father talking to his son. That's how he talked to the king. You know how sometimes you have to kind of word things carefully,
right,
so that a child understands what you're saying. That doesn't mean you're flattering the child. Doesn't mean you're bullying the child. It just means that you're adjusting your language so the child can understand you. He was respectful, but he was still talking like that to him. That's very different than being a flatterer at court.
For sure, yeah. That makes sense. No, it makes sense. That makes sense. So we've got a lot coming up for the Legendary Women of World History, your series that you're so proud of and should be proud of. And I want to mention this before we begin to head out, because you always sneak a little Easter egg or two in your book. So give us a little heads up on that.
Yes, there are 2 Easter eggs. In one case, and I have this in the opening chapter, but one is I have a quote from the very first episode that Peter Capaldi made as the Doctor. Is called Deep Breath. So Series 8, Episode 1, I have a quote from there that got snuck into one of the chapters. It's a short quote. I will say it's a short quote, but it is a quote. And it just sort of comes up in speech, and Anne says the line. Exactly, says the same line that the Doctor says in this episode of Deep Breath. And then there's another one where I'm describing events that were happening. This is exposition relating to politics and diplomacy and so forth. And I do it in sort of the style of another scene that happened in the end of Series 9. And the challenge is to figure out which episode and what the Doctor does and says when he finishes that same task.
All right. We got some little nuggets in there for people to pay attention as they read. Oh, Laurel Rockefeller, you are just an amazing person. I'm so glad we had this opportunity to share this today. And obviously there's more coming our way, so we got to keep an eye on you. Share, if you would, where folks can learn more about you, where they can purchase these books.
Obviously, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all the major retailers globally. But the way that you find the links is on my website, laurelarockefeller.com.
Right. LaurelARockefeller.com. All right, my friend, you have just titillated all of our senses today. You know, we've got to get out there and read the book, and then we've got all the singing that you've shared with us, and I'm always so proud to know you and have these conversations. Any final words before we head out?
I think it's just research everything, learn everything that you can. One of the wonderful things was Richelieu is that he was able to be a moderate. And in today's world, we need a lot more moderation, and we need to allow ourselves to sort of pull back from some of our extreme emotions and kind of think things more rationally and learn how to be more civil. And we won't be kind, as the 12th Doctor says so often. Let's be kind to each other. Let's not be so focused on our own points of view. And let's start looking at the big picture the way Richelieu did, because I think that was one of the great things about him.
Oh, I love that you left us with that. Thank you. Be kind. Laurel Rockefeller, you are a kind person. LaurelARockefeller.com. Head over to her website. Thank you again, my friend, for this beautiful and wonderful opportunity.
Happy holidays to you. Obviously, we have Easter coming up, and I look forward to talking to you when I'm ready to publish the next one. How about that?
I will be here.
Okay.